One of the engines brought over from the USA was this tank engine, number 30075. Now on the Swanage Railway, it worked in Yugoslavia for over 40 years, after it was sent over from Britain in 1946. It was built for temporary war services, so it is quite remarkable that it is still in such fine working condition. But the principal American locomotives brought over were the purpose-built standard heavy freight S-160 class 280s. After they were shipped over from America, they were made ready at works in Britain before being used on the hard-pressed railways for 2 years. In late 1944, they were repaired and sent over to the continent after the Normandy landings. These were some of the variety of locomotive types designed by the US Army Transportation Corps, which were built in large numbers at the Baldwin, Lima and Alco Locomotive Works in the USA. Some 400 S-160s were put to work on British railways to help cope with the increase in freight traffic caused by Bolero. In spite of a design fault which caused a few deaths when boilers blew up, their totally un-English appearance caused quite a stir. Austerity was the order of the day, so the locomotives were designed with no frills, which meant building needed few special materials. With fabricated rather than forged parts, they were capable of running on poor track and were easy to repair in wartime conditions. They were not designed to last, but many of them continued to run successfully for decades. The British Austerities were designed for the War Department. The WD-280s and later the 210s were derived from the highly successful LMS-8F 280 from William Stanier. 935 280s and 152 210s were built between 1943 and 1945. 3 of these impressive 210s still exist today. One of them is now called Gordon and runs on the Severn Valley Railway. The 210 was heavier than the 280, but because the weight was distributed over 10 axles, it was in fact lighter. The problem of getting 10 coupled axles around sharp curves was overcome by having no flanges on the middle pair of driving wheels. In the USA and Europe, air brakes were the norm, so all these military heavies had to be fitted with Westinghouse brake pumps on the side of the smoke bowl. With 34,215 pounds of power and driving wheels half an inch larger than the 280, the 210 could go faster because it steamed more freely. On the continent later in the war, they would often be seen hauling passenger trains, as they do now on the Severn Valley Railway, which is mostly single track. This means that tablets have to be exchanged between the driver and signalman to ensure that Gordon has the right of way on the next stretch of single track. Gordon was originally WD number 73651 and was used on the Longmoor Military Railway for training purposes, hence the LMR on the tender, which does not stand for London Midland Region. It has a bigger boiler than the 280s, a 40 square foot firebox made of steel with a rocking grate, like in American locos. To fire it was about as much as any one man could manage. It was renumbered WD 600 in 1952, but Longmore ceased operations in 1969 and Gordon now belongs to the National Army Museum, who lease it to the Severn Valley Railway. In the southeast, the Cantonese Sussex Railway is still going strong at the end of the 20th century.
The line was built in 1900, which is very, very late for railways. It was the first light railway in the country to reach areas that had been missed out in railway mania of the 1840s and 1850s. It connected Robertsbridge in East Sussex with Headcorn in Kent, made very modest profits initially, but because it was built very cheaply, the stations were usually a way away from the villages they were supposed to serve, so it was very vulnerable to road competition from the 1920s onwards. Started losing money in 1926, struggled on through the war when it became an important secondary route to the coast, taking lots of materials down to the south coast when the main lines were affected by bombing. And then after the war it was nationalised and became part of British Railways for 6 brief years when they decided that it couldn't go on running uneconomic trains, and it closed in 1954.
During the conflict, the military were very short of shunting engines. Again, the Americans stepped in with about 370 060 tanks. Like the 280s, they looked typically American and were scaled down for our smaller loading gauge. The WD engines were of the traditional British design of industrial inside cylinder saddle tanks, but for rapid production they were modified for economy in manpower. They were built by 6 different manufacturers between 1943 and 1945. This British type was also built after the war until 1953. These Austerity shunting engines didn't often appear on the home railways during the war, as most of them were used at military depots. But after the war, 75 were taken over by the LNER, while many others were put to work at the collieries and other industrial sites.
First is number 65, which was built in 1943 by the Vulcan Iron Works in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was shipped across the Atlantic in kit form as part of the preparations for D-Day. Similar engines were actually then transported across the Channel, but number 65 and its partner number 238 that are here at the Cantonese Sussex Railway didn't see action in the war, and afterwards they went to first Southampton docks and then later to the Ashford Wagon Works, where they were used as shunting engines before they were saved for preservation here at the Cantonese Sussex Railway.
Typically, number 65 has a parallel boiler, outside cylinders and 3 enormous domes on top of the boiler. 2 of them are sandboxes. It's now in its southern livery without its name Maunsell, which it carried until recently. Because the Southern equipped it for working on the docks, it was fitted with a radio telephone. The British as well as the American tank engines were sturdy and capable of hauling quite heavy trains over lightly laid tracks with sharp curves. The Kenton East Sussex Railway No. 24, Rolvenden, was formerly WD No. 200 and was recently called William H. Austin. In contrast to the modern stock being hauled by No. 65, No. 24 is hauling an extraordinary collection of vintage coaches. These wartime tanks have proved very popular with the preservation groups, and no less than 43 of these engines, and 5 of the American ones, are working today on railways up and down the country. The preservation groups have done a magnificent job in restoring them and painting them in attractive liveries, a far cry from the drab black of the war. Number 24's train comprises an LNWR director's saloon with verandas, an SECR family saloon, an SECR full second and a GER composite and a district railway full first. In spite of its 23,870 pounds of power, it seems to be having quite a struggle with this lot, which consists of old 4- and 6-wheelers. Some of them were rescued from such places as allotments, where they had been used as hen houses.